Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening for another one of our another webinar in our series of summer support sessions. This session this evening is going to look at an introduction to grassroots football clubs and kind of the effective club governance structures available in grassroots sports. Primarily, the content is going to be aimed at clubs who are not registered charities or registered companies, so the default position of unincorporated associations. But we will take a look at what that means, what the responsibilities are, and then how to progress, or when you might want to consider progressing to a registered entity or potentially registering as a charity. So over the course of the presentation, we will look at the basics of unincorporated associations. And if you don't know what that means right now, don't worry, I will explain. We'll then look at the underlying principles of good governance and what we and the FA effectively expect of our member clubs. Also look at potential appropriate management structures for long-term sustainability and options for future growth if you do wish to look at legal structures that are available. What unfortunately we cannot go into, and I won't be going into, is kind of financial strategy. Partly that's because that would make this evening a bit too big, and we do have a separate session on that over the next couple of weeks. And we're also not able to specifically advise which model any club should or should not adopt. Technically, that would then border onto legal advice, so you need to contact someone who has that specialist knowledge in that. But hopefully this evening what we'll do is give a bit of an overview around different terms that are out there, different structures that are available, and some basic tips for good governance. So starting off, just looking at unincorporated associations, and don't worry if it's a term you've never heard before. I'll try and break it down as much as possible. So unincorporated association is an association of like-minded individuals coming together for a common purpose. So in other words, a club. This is the default effectively for most community amateur sports groups. And by default, I would say that if you don't know what your legal entity is, you are probably an unincorporated association. So if you're just a group of friends who have set up a team for your Sunday league, you'll be considered one. And just to put that into a little bit of context, according to our records and the information that clubs have declared to us through whole game system, about 97% of our clubs are unincorporated associations. So the benefits I'll come into in a little bit of detail shortly, but in effect, an unincorporated association is run for and by its members with little outside interference, for good or for bad. From our perspective at the County FA, what that means is we will let you manage yourselves, but it also means that we have very limited ability to intervene if things do go wrong. So as such, clubs are very much self-governing. You set your own structure, you set your own rules. However, you should still have these in place as it helps everyone know who does what and, importantly, how. So we'll set all of your terms around how the management committee are elected, who the members are, and what steps that can be taken around potentially removing a member, and also look at that kind of financial responsibility and so forth. Crucially, however, and I will come on to this in a bit more detail shortly, is that all members are deemed jointly and severally liable for club actions and financial obligations. So the major negative or the major concern around the structure is the implications it has on personal risk and liability. So even though this is the loosest and most flexible format of club governance, there are still some minimum expectations. The first is that the club should still have a club constitution. This sets out effectively how the club is run and by whom, and is a requirement under FA regulations. Now, as the County FA, we don't tend to insist on seeing a copy of a club constitution for every single club. I think with 600 odd clubs registering to us every season, that would possibly be unmanageable. However, given the increased concern around legislation and risks in and around grassroots football, particularly from a personal point of view, it is something we may look at enforcing a bit more stringently, or trying to support particularly new clubs with setting up and getting off the ground. And certainly this webinar is part of that process. So, as I say, the Constitution will set out who is running the club and how. Technically, it does form as a requirement under FA regulations, and also it becomes a requirement for creating a club bank account. Now, again, club bank account is a mandatory requirement for FA regulations, but it's not one that we mandate on seeing or seeing evidence of at the point of affiliation. However, there's a real reason why it's important to have a club bank account, and that again is that it helps protect club officers as volunteers and insulates yourselves, and as I say, it kind of helps reduce that risk on you as individuals. The third expectation or minimum requirement would be a list of members. Again, this should be required and set out in the Constitution as to who constitutes a member. But the importance of that list is, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is that all members of a club are jointly and severally liable for club actions, and therefore you need to be able to produce that list of members should it ever be required. Again, as a county FA, we could come down and mandate or require or compel you to provide us with that list, but would only ever do so in exceptional circumstances. Next up, those members need to be able to hold club officers to account at an annual general meeting where they can vote on key decisions, including the election of officers for the coming year. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail shortly. And finally, hopefully, obviously, you must still then comply with footballing regulations that are in place, particularly around safeguarding and so forth. So even though it is the most flexible and, as I say, that basic entry-level constitution of a club or definition of what constitutes a club, it does still come with some expectations and some requirements. Now, if you don't currently have a constitution, the FA does have a set of what they call standard club rules, which is available as a template. That's something that we can provide. It's also available on the FA website and in the downloadable FA handbook. So we will still direct new clubs to use this. It is the standard club rules do also then form the basis of constitution that's required if you do want to become England Football accredited. So it is very quick and easy to complete. But there is still an expectation that the requirements included must still be met. Yes, it's a requirement to have one, but it needs to be lived and breathed and not just a tick box exercise to say that you have one. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail now just around the implications of that structure of an unincorporated association. One of the key things to consider here from a legal perspective is that unincorporated associations have no separate legal identity in their own right. A registered company or a registered charity becomes a legal person. It becomes an entity, a defined entity that can enter into agreements on its own behalf. An unincorporated association doesn't have that, which means that the individuals who enter into an agreement on behalf of that organization are actually taking on independent liability or independent, are entering into those agreements independently. So what this means is that as an unincorporated association, you are not able to enter into an agreement in the club's name. They would always be in the name of the officer signing them. So, for example, it could be the club secretary that has signed an agreement with the local council to rent the pitch every Saturday morning for the next 30 weeks. That individual club secretary is actually accountable for that contract or that agreement with the council. Also means that the club cannot be sued. So again, any legal action would be against the officers or the named members or the individual entering into that agreement, not the club as a body within its own right. Finally, the club cannot hold any long-term assets such as land or investments. Again, these will technically be in the name of the officer signing them. So if that individual were to leave the club, there should be some kind of transfer of that agreement, of that asset, to a new person within an equivalent role. If that doesn't happen, then the club could actually find themselves in difficulty later down the line as something that they rely on as an asset is technically not within their name and no longer associated with them. The other implication that's not listed on the screen here is that an unincorporated association cannot employ staff. So again, you cannot enter into a legal contract either with another body or with an individual. I mentioned the term joint and several liability a couple of times, and I'm going to delve into that in a bit more detail. And this is really the biggest area of risk around unincorporated associations. Now, as unincorporated associations are not considered separate legal entities, it means that the members are, quote, jointly and severally liable for any debts that may be incurred. So I'm going to pick that apart. Joint means it's a collective responsibility for their actions. So every single member has a shared responsibility for the contracts that they enter into, those agreements, and the risk that's incurred. But several also means that they can be held individually responsible in order to meet those liabilities. Practical terms, what this means is that a creditor, let's say someone that the club owes money to, can try to recover all of the debt, so the total amount owed, from any member of the club, regardless of their individual share of the liability. Effectively, it works on the basis that the creditor must be repaid first, and only after that happens can the members try to figure out how to split the costs. So as a member of a club, I could be held individually responsible for paying back a creditor for all funds, and then have to seek to get repaid by the other members once that has happened. Now, I fully appreciate this all sounds very legal, all sounds very intimidating, and particularly if you are in a position where you are running a club, may be enough to scare you off from that. And that's definitely not the intention here. I'm trying to be upfront about the structures that are in place and make sure that people are aware of the risk that comes with that. However, you have to hope that any of these kind of situations are very unlikely. And if you put those other structures in place around good governance, which we'll come on to in a moment, but things like the Constitution, effective management structures, financial checks on your accounts, annual general meetings, annual reporting, and so forth, you can actually mitigate those risks. And again, it means that that individual liability hopefully reduces, even though that principle of joint and several liability still exists there underneath. For those of you that do think that, particularly given the size of the club, this is something that is getting too much of a risk for you as individuals, I will also then look at alternative legal structures later. So just going to quickly recap the pros and cons for unincorporated associations before moving on to governance structures. So in the pros, there are few legal requirements. So there's no annual filing required, for example, to Companies House or the Charities Commission. There's no legal or accounting filing that you're required to do to the County FA. Effectively, you can crack on and manage yourselves. That also means there's privacy and flexibility. So there's no outside scrutiny beyond any applicable legal or football regulations. So things like the safeguarding requirements, the annual affiliation process, any complaint processes that may involve the County FA and so forth. The organisation is also member controlled. So within certain limits, members can set their own rules. And finally, members can participate in proceeds. So assets are jointly held by the members and can be distributed among the members if the club is then wound up. On the cons, however, as I mentioned before, there is that issue that there is no separate legal entity. So there is personal liability for individuals entering into contracts and joint and several liability for all members for any debts incurred by the club. So I'm now going to talk about how you can try to mitigate some of these risks and some of the principles of good governance that will help hopefully make the club sustainable and reduce any concerns you may have in the short term. First up, I'm just going to talk about what constitutes good governance. And at its broadest terms, good governance means that decisions are taken in a fair and appropriate manner. That means that they're going to be transparent, they're going to be based on consensus, which means there's participation from members. It's inclusive. All members have an opportunity to have a say in how the club is being run. Management committee is accountable and responsive to the wishes of its members. And finally, all decisions are made legally. And when I say legally here, I'm not talking tort and Old Bailey and the criminal process. I just mean in line with the club's constitution, that you're following the process, and any of those decisions are bound in fair process and abide by the terms of the membership organisation. The principle that underpins all this is around effectively democratic process. So starting in the top right there, the members of the club appoint the committee on an annual basis. So they will appoint a committee to run the club on their behalf, make those executive decisions, ensure that there's fair, sustainable financial structures in place, and empower those people to run the club on their behalf. Committee go ahead and then make those decisions over the course of the season, but then report back to the members at the annual general meeting the next year, where the members can hold them to account. So they can quiz them, particularly around any governance decisions they've made, any financial decisions or strategies they put in place. And if the members don't agree with what they've done, effectively they can choose to elect somebody else into those positions in the following year. That cycle then repeats itself on an annual basis. So this very much comes back to those comments earlier around unincorporated associations being member organisations being run by the members for the members. This model can then also apply across different aspects of the club, so including subcommittee structures and so forth. Could be that members appoint the subcommittee, or the executive committee appoint a subcommittee to delegate powers to them. They make those decisions, but then report back to the executive committee annually, where again there's some kind of check and challenge process in place and reappointment for the following year. And this is where annual general meetings become particularly important. There's pretty much a standard agenda that should be done at every club AGM. You may want to add other matters at the meeting each year. However, typically we would expect to see some kind of report from the management committee about the operations, key decisions they've taken over the course of that year, key decisions or strategies they're looking to implement for the coming season. A financial report, and that includes providing copies of accounts or a balance sheet so that members can see how their money has been spent over the last year, but also check and challenge that financial health of the club. The AGM should also then have a section for the election of the committee for the following year, and then approve any changes to the constitution around kind of membership rules and how some of those decisions are made. By going through this process, you tick off some of those key principles of good governance we discussed a few minutes ago. So you've got accountability, transparency, participation, focus on consensus, and the legality. You're making sure the club is being run in accordance to the rules that it has set for itself. The other thing is, as an AGM, that all members should be allowed to attend. Within the constitution, it should define who a member technically is. You may go down a route where all members are, where all players are automatically members, or if you're a youth club, that a player's parents may become a member, or you may decide there is a separate category of voting membership for certain circumstances. Again, that would be written in the constitution. So there's some other considerations you may want to think about when looking at the management structure and the governance structure for the club. First is management committee size and youth as subcommittees. And there's no right or wrong size or structure that we can really dictate in this one. It really will depend on the needs of the club. You may find that a one-team adult club can get by on a committee of 3 or 4 or 5 people, whereas a 60-team youth, adult, veteran, male, female disability club wants to have a much bigger management committee in place, use subcommittees, have different working groups and so forth to play a more hands-on management role over different aspects of the club. So you need to work out what the appropriate size is going to be for yourself, and then if you need subcommittees, and if so, how do those subcommittees work? How are people appointed, and how are they then held accountable? You may also want to consider representation on the committee. Again, if you've got a large number of teams, you could adopt a representative model where each team Well, if you've got a small to medium number of teams, sorry, you may have a process where every team has a representative on a management committee. If you've got a large number of age groups, you could go down age group representatives, you could go down category representatives, so male, female, disability, and so forth. Again, it's very much got to be a decision as to what is going to be most appropriate for that club. You also then want to think about diversity of the committee. One of the key things that comes up, particularly when looking around conflicts of interest, is actually around diversity of households. And this is all said without casting aspersions, but if one couple fills all roles, for example, does that mean that there's diversity of thoughts and that conflicts are going to be correctly managed? Or does actually your committee need to reflect the makeup of your player demographics, have a broader base, broader ideas coming through, different age groups represented, and so forth, to make sure that actually there is a diverse voice within that committee, there's new opinions coming in, and there is effective debate throughout that process. There should also then be a formal policy in place and adhered to around conflicts of interest. So conflicts of interest is real or perceived. Typically, I would always say if you think someone may question if there's a conflict of interest, always err on the side of caution and assume that there is, or act as if there was. What we're not trying to do here, again, is cast aspersions or say that someone's integrity is being questioned, but actually by effectively managing conflicts of interest, you're protecting all parties. So you're protecting the individual that others outside could perceive as having a conflict or a vested interest in the decision. So just to give you some examples around when conflicts of interest would apply, maybe on decisions over partnerships or sponsorships or suppliers where someone has a financial involvement with the other party, or it could be involving internal complaints or disciplinary action where there may be a family or a family relationship going on. You may also wish to consider term limits for officers. I fully appreciate that it's hard enough to get volunteers in as it is, so I would recommend considering this, but being realistic to it. However, benefit of term limits are that it does provide diversity of thought, and there is an argument to say that actually having term limits could foster additional volunteering within the club, as people may see a pathway to different opportunities. They may find that may feel that their voice is going to carry more weight, because actually if they volunteer within a few years, they may be in actually a decision-making position rather than it being a bit of a closed shop. If you don't go down the route of term limits, we would really strongly urge that the club should at the very least consider succession planning or contingency planning should a key officer no longer be able to fulfill their role for whatever reason. Particularly if you only have one or two key officials, that represents a massive risk as to the long-term future and sustainability of the club. If someone has to step away because of an emergency, poor health, and so forth, you want to make sure that actually the institution has longevity and is able to continue. I'm just going to touch quickly now on club members. I mentioned earlier that it should be defined in the constitution as to who is a member for the purposes of voting rights and making those decisions. So you may want to consider whether the members of the club, as I said before, are all players or parents in the case of under 18s, whether it is coaches, whether you have a paying membership structure, so only those individuals that pay an annual subscription fee get the opportunity to vote, or whether you have voting members as a completely separate category. Again, there's no right or wrong way as long as it is clearly laid out in the constitution. If you believe that actually it should only be the coaches voting on the management and future of the club particularly, let's say, in a youth club, then that needs to be clearly explained and set out in the constitution. If not, anybody that's a member of the club pays an annual subscription would typically be deemed to be a member and therefore should have the right under the constitution to vote at AGMs and be involved in that decision-making process. Now, on the flip side of that, the management committee has the right to expel a member if they believe it is in the best interests of the club. So within the constitution, there should be reference to a code of conduct and the rights of the committee, or the obligations of members to uphold that code of conduct, act in the best interest of the club, and if not, understand that there could be consequences. Typically, I would say that any decision must be appealable to another body within the club. Now, depending on the size of the club and the committee, this could be a separate subcommittee or panel of the management committee, or it could be a case that there's a disciplinary committee that makes the initial decision that then gets appealed to the full management committee, or it could be that any appeals or action against the decision of the management committee could be appealed to an independent panel of other members within the club or the full AGM ultimately. In the past, we've run sessions around managing internal complaints within clubs, and we will look to do that again over the next few weeks as this summer series continues. But I would just like to highlight the point on the left on the screen, which is that clubs are independent organisations. So as a county FA, we're not able to dictate who should or should not be a member or overturn a club decision. So as part of that complaints process, if something does get escalated up to us at the county, we will try to support, we will review the process that decision has been taken by, we will perhaps provide feedback, we may make recommendations, but we have no binding power to overturn a club decision. And we take that seriously because we don't believe it is our place to be deciding who should or should not be a member of your club. You have to have that right and independence to manage it as you see fit, provided you do go through appropriate processes to do so. So that pretty much covers unincorporated associations and, as I said, the basic level of governance that we hope and expect from our clubs here in Berks and Bucks. I will now go on to just look at other legal structures that are available should you feel that you are in a position where an unincorporated association model is no longer right or relevant for your club. So the first is a company limited by guarantee. So when I say that they are limited, that means that they are registered with Companies House and become a full legal entity within their own right. So a company limited by guarantee is independent legal body. It is owned by its members, and each of those members then has limited individual liability. From a technical point of view, what was the Constitution now becomes Articles of Association, and your management committee effectively become an elected but unpaid board of directors. Now, because the club is now a recognised legal entity, the club as a organisation can start assuming liability for any of its contracts or debts. The individual membership liability is limited, hence company limited, to a nominal amount. It may well be typically that each member is limited, or their liability is limited to £1. It's a token amount, but just says that if that organisation is wound up and the club as an organisation does default on its debts, as an individual, you're not going to be out of pocket. This also means that the club as an organisation is able to hold assets in its organisation's name, and this may also open the doors to some additional fundings because there is, as a body that is offering funds, whether that is a commission or a charity commission, a council, another independent body, they know that there is security because they're giving their funding to an institution rather than an individual. The flip side, however, is that members are not shareholders, so they do not have any claim over the dividends or profits or assets if the club is wound up. There's what's known as an asset lock. And one thing that can be said is that even though you are a company limited by guarantee, this does not mean that you have to be deemed as profit making, and this is the most common type of incorporation for not-for-profit organisations due to that asset lock. So any profits held by the club at the point that they're wound up will be dispersed in accordance with the constitution, but would not go to the members themselves. Variation on this is a company limited by shares. So very similar to the limited by guarantee, in that it's a recognised independent legal body with everything that that entails. And in terms of the governance structure with the Articles of Association and the Board of Directors. However, whereas with a company limited by guarantee, every member becomes or has equal financial liability and input into the organisation. In this instance, a limited number of shares are issued. Those shares can then be transferred between different members or accumulated by members in different proportions, and therefore those holders are able to take a share in the profit of the club. Moving away from the commercial aspect and just looking at some of the other sporting structures available, we come on to CASCs, or Community Amateur Sports Clubs. So these are community organisations where they are able to clearly demonstrate that the main purpose of the organisation is the promotion of amateur sports. So part of that is within their articles or within their constitution, they must have an open membership policy. So it's not being restricted to any particular group, and they must be able to demonstrate an amateur ethos. So it wouldn't be a position where you're paying any players and so forth. The members must actively participate in sport. So you can't be a kind of a non-paying casual member. You must be actively involved. And in the organisation of it, that you must also then pass, if you're on the management committee, a fit and proper persons test. If the organisation were to wind up for whatever reason, because it is a community amateur sports club, those assets must then stay in sports. One thing I would say about this is that there is a large degree of regulation and restrictions around CASCs. They're relatively new as bodies, and therefore it brings with it quite a bit of administration. It's quite a niche area, so it needs a fair amount of thought and expert legal advice. So definitely recommend seeking that if it is something that you are interested in. Benefits of being a CASC, though, is that it does open doors to some additional funding. Finally, just looking at organisations that may become registered charities. Now, the threshold to do this is that you must be an organisation whose objects, so your purpose, is wholly and exclusively charitable in law. From a constitutional or governance point of view, your officers, so the management committee, now become trustees rather than management committee officers or directors. You must register with the Charities Commission rather than Companies House or having zero registration at all. And you cannot have social members. So that means that you must have registered members rather than kind of casual members. Again, can open the door to additional funding or preferential rates, tax benefits, which may also attract some sponsors. But you must also be careful that this cannot be reversed. So you can't flip between being a registered charity or a for-profit organisation. Once you go down this route, you would have to effectively reconstitute as another body to be able to do that. Again, there's a lot of additional legislation and responsibilities associated with charitable status. So if you are interested in it, please do seek proper legal advice. I'm just going to talk about some thresholds which might trigger when you want to change. First thing to state is that, as I said at the very beginning, it is for each club to determine what you believe the best legal structure is for yourself. That may well be unincorporated association based on the size and risk and liabilities of the club, or as I said before, you may want to consider one of the more regulated routes. Typically, where we would advise you to have these conversations and start seeking advice would be if you are looking to acquire land, to employ staff, enter into a long-term contract, or you are looking at a 5 to 10-year development plan. We would certainly recommend looking at some of those options available to you. I'm going to just touch briefly around where you can get some additional support now. So up on the screen is a screenshot of the new FA Club portal, where hopefully you will go to register players and do the England football accreditation. This is also where we have now got the information regarding 97% of our clubs being listed as unincorporated associations. So if that is different, we would ask that you update it here. But effectively, if you go to Club Portal, My Club and Organisation Profile, you will see a tab across the top there, which is for legal structure. Now within here, there is a link so that you can download the FA's Guide to Football Club Structures. This has been produced in partnership with the FA's legal partners, Muckle LLP, and is up to date. So it was issued just under 2 years ago now. It is under constant review by Muckle, but my understanding is there haven't been any changes since it was issued a couple of years ago, which was the first big change in about 10 years. Much of the information I've pulled out this evening has come from this guide, but obviously goes into it in a lot more detail, probably in a lot clearer than I've waffled on this evening. And I would recommend reaching out to Muckle in particular if you did want to explore this in more detail. It used to be that every accredited club or charter standard, as it was then, would have access to a limited amount of free legal advice from Muckle. It's a new model we're currently operating, which is that as a county, we get a set number of hours that can be then distributed amongst our clubs. So if you do find yourself in a position where you are looking to do this, please contact us and we can advise you whether we're able to offer up any of our quota of free legal advice to that. The other item I wanted to direct you towards is a self-assessment that we've put together over the last couple of years. Effectively, this is a Excel sheet on steroids, which we put together that is written in such a way that you click through. There's 7 different categories, and it offers you opportunities for reflection and kind of look at how your club is currently structured around. It's probably about 50 odd criteria within those 7 different categories. It'll ask you things like how often you hold an AGM, how many people on the management committee, if you have a development plan in place, if you have a structure in place for agreeing to enter new teams and so forth. And based on that, it will effectively give you a RAG rating. It's then up to yourself as the club to decide whether those reds or ambers are acceptable risks and aren't applicable to you, or whether it's something that you might want support on developing. We can then work with you on a governance development plan, and we do this through kind of one-to-one meetings, and then 6 monthly or annual catch-ups just to see how progress is being made against that. If you would like to go through that process, then please get in touch with myself. The email address is on the screen there, and I can send that through. It's very much club-led, so it'll get sent over to you, and it's for yourselves to review internally. I can help on kind of clarifying certain issues, but then effectively it would be for the club to complete, and then we would set up a feedback meeting afterwards where we can go through those results and identify any concerns or changes.